Okay, good morning again. I think we should be starting. I don't know whether everybody has the things for the translation. I mean, we call this Beyond Capital Realism, and we changed it. We didn't change it, as we probably should have. I mean, this kind of keywords we use as a working thing, but then at the end it appears in the title. But anyway, this first session or this first panel was a way to measure and to check the conceptual framework we are working with. And for this occasion, we have the participation of Marco, Yaiza, and Kier. And at the same time, we thought it was a good idea to have also the participation of the anti-fascists here with Bonia and Kuba. And Kuba, sorry, I tried to pronounce it properly. Kuba Debsinski and Bonia Stefanska. Can you repeat it for me? Stefaninska. Bodna, sorry. Bodna Stefaninska. So as we shall proceed, starting with Yaiza, then it will be Marco Arbale, Key Melbourne, and the anti-fascist group, year representatives. I will have a very short introduction of the three speakers, so that I don't interrupt the sequence. Well, Yaiza is, well, we've known each other for a long time. She's one of the people I admire the most. She is a lecturer in visual cultures department at Goldsmiths. This is a new thing because she was Saint Martins for a long period as well. In London, she has a very long curriculum. She was head of public programs at MACBA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona. She was also in CENDEAC, it's an art institution in Murcia, in the southern part of Spain. And she's published a lot and intervened in many forums, including Imagining Curatorial Practice after 1972, Cortocircuitos del Museo y la Autonomía, Short Circuits of the Museum and Autonomy, and Who Needs Exhibition Studies? And then Marco is somebody I also know for quite a while. He's also a member of the Institute of Radical Imagination. That is a new agency that probably will have we'll have the opportunity to present tomorrow in the assembly. He's a member of SALE in Venice, SALE Docs, a collective managing an independent space of visual arts in Venice. And in addition to that, he's also part of In Common, a research team that is also part of the University of Venice. Sorry, translators. And Marco is being always very active in this experimentation of the monstrous institution in the relationship between formal institutions and new institute practices. After Marco, we'll have Kier Melbourne, lecturer in political economy and organization at the University of Leicester. And he recently published Generation Left, explaining why young people are moving to the left while older people are tending towards the right. Something that it doesn't happen everywhere, I would say. And he's also co-host of ACM podcast at Novara Media. And then, well, I already introduced Kuba and Bodna, and I think that probably it will be good if you finish when you end this panel. Okay, I'll give the word to my dear friend Yaiza.
Okay, so I hope that you can all hear me. I'm keenly aware that the point of today is not listening to any of us up here, but rather to have time to discuss some of the important issues that we're all being asked to think about. So in the interest of precision and for the sake of the translators, I will be reading my paper. For the sake of brevity, this keeps a rather polemical tone, but hopefully in a way that is not unnecessarily crass. The specific question that this panel was asked to address concerned new forms of aesthetic imagination venturing beyond capitalist realism and ossify divisions between art and politics, and I will stick to that. However, if you forgive the rather autobiographical detail, I'd like to mention that shortly after I was invited to take part in this conversation, I joined the Visual Cultures department at Goldsmiths College. The very department, of course, where Mark Fisher, who coined this use of capitalist realism, was based before his tragic and premature death. He was someone I knew and respected, not because he was a friend, because we were never close, but because the circle of so-called continental philosophy in London was really that small. Hence, this was a very enjoyable opportunity to reread an exhilarating text I hadn't been back to since finding it in the midst of the 2010 student protest in the UK, a time that feels oddly remote by now. But it also felt strange to think about coming to Poland to talk about internationalism after the end of globalization with terms that had been coined in my proverbial backyard. Strange and problematic. So capitalist realism, and I mean the text here, not the condition, offers a still compelling diagnosis of the structure of feeling in Britain in the early 21st century. And this is a very British text, I think. A widespread resignation to and embroilment with the mechanisms of capital, the generalized exhaustion of hopes and unfulfilled desires, punctuated by moments of interpassivity and, to use Fisher's brilliant coinage, depressive hedonia. The diagnosis is one that pertains a failure of imagination. As the often repeated mantra goes, capitalist realism takes over when it becomes easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So in the midst of this dire state of affairs, it suggests a central position for cultural productions as the ones that might reactivate our imaginatory powers. In its startling first chapter, Fisher asks, what happens when the young are no longer capable of producing surprises? A plea is then made for the vitality of a culture in which the new defines itself in response to what is already established. At the same time, the established has to reconfigure itself in response to the new. A culture that is no longer contested is not culture at all, we are told. Startlingly, this plea for the new is made invoking the conservative figures of Harold Bloom and T.S. Eliot, so that tradition with a capital T, that is the Western tradition, seems to retain its place here as the standard against all that is new should be checked. Consistent with this line, Fisher calls for cultural producers to recognize that the most powerful forms of desire are precisely craving for the strange, the unexpected, the weird. And this, he adds, can only be supplied by artists and media professionals who are prepared to give people something different from that which already satisfies them, by those, that is to say, who are prepared to take a certain kind of risk. So that if imagination has failed us, it is the very unfulfillment of our desire that still lends it the potential to demand its due, so that the training of that desire remains a key task for progressive cultural political work. While retaining much sympathy for Fisher's impatience with the kind of manufactured culture that responds directly to the half-baked demands of focus group or funding bodies, I'm also wary of how this valorization of cultural forms remains tied to the very particular generative logic of the negation of the old as a production of the new, a logic at the heart, of course, of European modernism. Art as the privileged side for the figuration or production of the new, including, ultimately, new social formations, and artists as their privileged agents. This seems particularly problematic with me as it enters into direct conflict with one of the moments when capitalist realism moves from the diagnostic to the prescriptive, with the proposition that an effective anti-capitalism must be a rival to capital, not a reaction to it. That anti-capitalism must oppose capitalist globalism with its own authentic universality. And it seems to me that it is the status of this authentic universality that we really need to grapple with here. This is a question that goes well beyond the frame established by Fisher himself, and I'd like to quickly acknowledge as well that Fisher's later work actually has a more promising classification of what a kind of cultural form might be, but I'm not going to go into that there. But it demands scrutiny once we take stock of the fact that this claim for a new universality reappears in a spate of recent theoretical interventions that have precisely tried to reclaim for themselves that task of imagining the future, and have found in the art world its most eager audience. We find it, for example, of course, in fitting avant-gardist form in both Alex Williams and Nick Snisek, Accelerationist Manifesto, and Laboria Kubonik's Xenofeminism, where this call for universality moves from the somewhat marginal position it occupied in Fisher to a much more central one. In this way, for example, Williams and Snisek idea that only another universalism can counter capitalism's own aggressively expansive one goes hand in hand with a rejection of any particular or localized modes of politics, what they famously derided as folk politics on the one hand, and folk politics here sounds like a moniker that might be, that might imply a kind of neat your own beer kind of hipsterism, but could equally apply to initiatives such as the PA in Spain or any other kind of horizontalist prefigurative ones. So on the other hand, with a reclamation of modernity as having been ceded too readily to the right. In this scheme, the left has wrongly assumed that only the cancellation of modernity can bring about the end of capitalism. That is to say, in order to counter capitalism's seeming insurmountability, we must mobilize its own big boy weapons against it. We need some new and improved universalism, some new and improved modernity. Similar arguments can be found in Laboria Kubonik's, when he argues for a universalist politics assembled from the needs of every human, cutting across race, ability, economic standing, and geographical position, while promoting a Promethean responsibility to face up to the scale and complexity of the political tasks at hand. Who exactly gets to play Prometheus here remains a pending question. It is not my intention here in any case to critically dissect this text. I defer that honor quite gladly to the already quite excellent and readily available criticisms provided by people like Sophie Lewis or Annie Go. What I need to single out is the way in which both of them combine a perfunctory disclaimer about the problematic embroilment of both universalism and modernity with colonial violence, within a gushing call for the renewal or reinvention. So returning now to our original question, and to conclude about the forms of aesthetic imagination that might both take us beyond capitalist realism and the division between art and politics, I would like to offer a few tentative thoughts in the light of the above. As the colonial thought has warned us, the idea that modernity might be redeemed from its colonial entanglements must be countered by a full acknowledgement of the indivisibility of modernity/coloniality. And against the idea of a universal that might, mimicking colonial logic itself, expand itself to include everyone cutting across race, ability, and others, we must insist on the violence of every claim on the universal. However, we must also be wary of the way in which calls for decolonization, which cannot mean anything other than a wholesale epistemic shift, an event of shattering proportions that leaves none of our structures intact, have been interpreted in art institutions, often before they have fully acknowledged the extent of their colonial legacy as a project among others. Even leaving aside the objection that such metaphorical use of decolonization, like Tak and Yang denounce, can simply brush away the more material question of restitutions, decolonization understood as a project to be carried out through auditing, consulting, recruiting, purchasing, or restructuring or research, can paradoxically serve to benchmark the soundness of the institution as it is. I've gone through my decolonization process, so I can get on as I was before. As Sarah Ahmed has so sharply pointed out, sometimes having a policy is the best alibi for continuing to do as you always did. Coloniality, then, is the condition of impossibility for any nostalgic return, however technocharged, to a reassuring role as the avant-garde of speculative, imaginative practice, to the desire to plant universalist flags on the present in the name of the future. We must wake up to the fact that the zeitgeist does not exist. More than anything else, it is this enduring desire for the redemption of a modernity without sin, I believe, that is keeping the schism between art and politics alive. as cultural workers, okay, there's like 3 words missing here that puzzle me. As cultural workers, we still have in residual possessions of unevenly distributed institutions, but institutions nevertheless, with local presence and international networks. So I would like to suggest that it might be in this that we can still find resources that we have not sufficiently mined for that abolition of the ossified division between art and politics. Relatedly, we might want to consider the possibility that it is not more imagination that we can contribute because we are not particularly well endowed with imaginary faculties, but experiments in normativity. As Fischer so vividly demonstrated in capitalist realism, bureaucracy has an enormous power to enforce structures of feelings, ways of understanding the present and imagining the future. It is through auditing, performance reviews, benchmarking, and streamlining that mistrust, exhaustion, hierarchy, and competition and hopelessness have been made to feel as inescapable facts. While neoliberalism was busy normativizing our imagination out of all hope, we have remained as cultural workers too tied to the idea that our spontaneous creativity is a precious good we impart on the world. As Laval and Dardot have recently suggested, we might have to give some credit to the idea that emancipatory practices can come about not by the spontaneous creation of new customs, but by decree. So before I get accused of dictatorial tendencies, we have, residually perhaps, we barely hold on to them, but we still have institutions where new notes of normativity could be rehearsed and new ways of being together could be tried out. At a time when a new authoritarian and quasi-military rule seems to be encroaching on us, rehearsing this for our coming together might be the most urgent artistic and political task of our time. We have much to achieve if we give up on our desire to be at the center of the world, to give the best account of the present, to know what is going on everywhere. We have much to achieve if we take our eye off IFLAX for a bit, and if we stop believing that the world biennial map is the map of the world. Our knowledge is not universally applicable. Our local experience might be useful, even exemplary elsewhere, but its usefulness is radically overestimated in the art sphere. Coming to an international conference might be lovely, but these are not the most politically important things we can do. We might have to get used to staying put, used to reclaiming our place in the pluriversal without attempting to remake the pluriversal in our name. The task might be one of creating spaces where we resist the enforced mobility of the art world and recognize the enforced immobility of many of our neighbors, while making the most of the already extant global networks of the art world as channels for solidarity, not exemplarity. Overcoming the ossified division between art and politics within the institution, then, might involve valorizing what has become obvious for a long time, that the institution as a site for conversation, as a space where we meet each other, where time and space are afforded to regain a sense of what it means to encounter each other and to discuss, is just, or more important, than the institution as a space where artworks are put on show for our aesthetic delectation. Okay. I think I more or less kept to time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yaiza. And then I think it's Marco's time.
Shall I just... So, here I am. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Jesus, Cuba, Mabel, and all the staff of the museum here. 2 days ago, I sat down and I tried to gather some thoughts. To write some thoughts, I came out with 6 pages. So I'm not going to read these. Of course, it would take too long. So I tried to summarize what I wrote, and I'm gonna go with some bullet points. Let's say bullet points that I hope are going to be useful for tomorrow assembly and discussion. So the first part of my talk is about, I really try to take literally the invitations of the organizer to think, first of all, about internationalism after the end of globalization, and secondly, about the issue of capitalist realism. So the first part is going to be titled Internationalism in the Crisis of Expansive Globalization. Expansive. I think I understand the way you, Jesus, and the other organizers uses the formula, the end of globalization. And indeed, I think a certain phase of globalization is definitely over, the expansive phase of globalization that, from the point of view of the artwork, probably was summarized by the explosion and the diffusion of biennials around the world, by the success of new generation of superstar curators, by the rhetoric of conversation, and by the optimistic representation of the world as a sort of connected archipelago. So I'm quoting basically Obrist and Edouard Glissant. That phase is definitely beyond our shoulders. And let's think about war. We learn to understand war as a sort of permanent police operation within the borders of the empire. And now what we're facing is the coming back to war to what could seem its old reason. So what we see in Turkey now, for example, the going back to the idea of defending national borders and affirming national sovereignty. And what is at stake there in Turkey and in the north of Syria, in Rojava, is basically the existence of one of the few, if not the only revolution, that is at the same time anti-state, anti-patriarchal, and anti-property. So I think that we don't put into risk our Turkish comrades that are here. I think that maybe yesterday, tomorrow, if we care about internationalism, we should raise our voice in solidarity of the revolution in Rojava and YPG. These are all symptoms that a certain phase of globalization is actually over. But I think globalization is not over. What we see is the scariest phase of neoliberal globalization. And there are at least three elements that come to my mind in order to prove that globalization is not over. The neoliberal project of globalization, even if more authoritarian and reactionary, is not over. First of all, the result of the last European elections, I think, proved that the Visegrad Group and similar options in the Mediterranean or Northern Europe are sort of scaled down, and that Germany is regaining control of Europe as a sort of new federal state that in a way controls, and it comes before national policies. The second element is that even reactionaries of neo-reactionaries think globally. Think of figures like Steve Bannon. Think of Russian interferences in foreign policies. Think of the Internationale of fundamentalist Christian organizations that are basically financed through global nets of financial capital. And the third element is the fact that the concentration of richness, in my opinion, still remain within the borders of a deterritorialized network of multinational financial capital. Especially those companies that own the property of very powerful algorithms and those that basically deal with energy. Someone speaks of sort of carbon and silicon capitalism, and I think that's the state of the art of this carbon silicon capitalism proves that we are still within a project of globalization, a globalized world. Of course, we do have to counteract the reactionary options. We would be crazy to overlook this. And also because even from the point of view of our worker, this coming back of reactionary options could mean something very bad. Could mean that art could, in a way, live its function of governance, the function basically that is typical within neoliberalist globalization of governing, of controlling subversive thinking, subversive imagery, turning it into cultural commodities, and censorship could come back, or the repression of dissent could come back. This is a reality. at the borders of Europe, but also in some European countries. So we should really think of that we are in a sort of differentiated moment where globalization process is not ended, but of course we have to deal with the reactionary forces that are sort of occupying political space in Europe and beyond. Let's go to the capitalist realism part of my intervention. And listening to Yaiza, I was thinking, oh man, I fall into the trap of universalism. So forgive me, but we are here in a way we are here also to sort of learn from each other. But I really think that it's exactly because globalization is not over that internationalism is important. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so important. We could just fight each one within the border of our nation states. And also, I think we should not overlook the problem of capitalist realism, even if the condition describes exactly the previous phase of globalization. A problem that is very British, of course, but I think it is at least Western, and I think the problem is still relevant today. Like we're not really outside the globalization, we are not really outside the cage of the condition of capitalist realism. Also because no neo-reactionary project has so far threatened the very idea that capitalism is unavoidable. So that's why I think that capitalist realism is still a relevant problem. Of course, this doesn't mean that art could be used in more vulgar ways, that art could become a tool for neo-fascist propaganda. It could happen and we should be very aware of it. Or that art can be and is the everyday life of art used as a very vulgar ornament to financial capital. I'm thinking here about the Songspiel, the work by Storiellat, The Tower, where you see like a gallerist and an artist that are very happy to pass under the censorship and the approval of capitalist oligarchs, of the Orthodox Church or police in exchange of fame and money. I also would like to, speaking of capitalist realism, I also would like to bring on the table sort of reflection on the role of utopian or utopian thinking, which has been really condemned since the writings of Marx and Fourier until Marcuse and until the operaist thinking. But the role of utopia, I think, could play. But utopia, I think, could play a new role in this realm, in this condition of capitalist realism. And I'm referring here, the point of departure for this reflection is a book that was published in 1973 by an Italian architecture historian whose name was Manfredo Tafuri. The title of the book was An Ease Project and Utopia. And it's about the harsh criticism of architecture and also artistic neo-avant-gardes of the 60s and the 70s, where Tafuri sees basically a common trait, sees these experiments sharing a common trait. So the refusal of a rationality of the project and the plan, and the massive recourse of utopian imagination. Tafuri was particularly referring to the so-called radicals, like groups of avant-gardist Italian architects like Archizoom or Superstudio, that are now, I think, living a second season of international success, and both academic and in terms of exhibitions, in terms of circulation within the art system. So Tafuri says these experiences completely abandon the idea of working on actual projects and the idea of addressing the capitalistic plan of the production of the space, and went into utopia and imagination. They were working, in fact, at the crossroad of architecture, design, visual arts, and performance. But this for Tafuri means something that is really sort of negative. First of all, it means to go to utopia means to find the shelter in imagination and not being able to grasp reality. It also means a nostalgia for the loss of status of the intellectual and the artist, the idea that cultural labor and creative labor is no more an exception, but is totally and completely subsumed within the capitalist machine. And also, he says more, he says that utopia actually began a function of a capitalist machine that needed to produce itself criticism. Utopia, Tafuri was seeing utopia as a sort of incitement, or even worse, cover of the rationality of the capitalist machine. On the contrary, he advocated for the fact that only by taking very seriously the proletarization of cultural and creative labor, and not to run away from its very condition, only from within this condition, a new project, a new creative project of a progressive project of a criticism was possible. I think this critique is valid today, is still valid. I mean, the fact that we have to take into account the very condition of cultural production today, and not just find the shelter in imaginary words. And of course, I think this is the case. This is the case even today. But I think the situation changes when we put Tafuri critique of utopia in the context of capitalist realism, with its impossibility to think of a future outside capitalism, and with what Mark Fisher defines the disappearance of the future. What I think now, and what I think we should also sort of discuss as art workers or as people working within the art field, is how to find and where to find spaces in which utopia and project can go together. The project of a liberated society. I think that utopia that was condemned to be unuseful could again become a useful element, could be something that breaks exactly with the condition of capitalist realism, but only at the condition that this is assembled with the project of liberation. And I'm really not speaking in theory here. I mean, we should be able to identify what political spaces can be used in order to assemble, in order to break the binarism of project or utopia. And again, the book of Mark Fisher could be a useful instrument in identifying these spaces, even considering the present reality. Yaiza mentioned the fact that bureaucracy could be for Mark Fisher one of the fields where capitalist realism could be broken. But he also mentioned another political field, that is the field of basically what now we call climate justice, the ecological catastrophe. And why? Because the ecological catastrophe basically shows not only basically shows that not only capitalism is not the only possible system, but is the very system that will destroy the biosphere, that will destroy the world. So I think we should really take into account the possibility of creating links and common paths together with the rising global movement for climate. And I also would like to mention the fact that some despite the fact that some of the most radical movements that we are seeing in Europe and beyond were started because of a protest against the tax on fuel, for example. So theoretically, against an ecological taxation, I would say. And I'm referring, of course, to the Gilets jaunes in France, but I'm also referring, for example, to what happened in Ecuador. In Ecuador, the reason that for the Ecuador movement to explode was exactly the same. I think that these movements, like the one that we see these days in Chile, are not at all anti-ecological. They only say something which is really important that we should not forget. We should never forget that ecological transition is actually needed, but rich people must pay for it. And that's something that is very important to recall. I think my time is almost gone, so I wanted to make a few examples of works and artists and alter institutions with which we worked at Sale that recovered a sort of utopian imagination. I think there is not time for it. We see a sort of neo-Marcusian universe that some artists are approaching. For example, the idea of I'm thinking about the work of Danilo Correale about about a society without work, in which full automation liberates people from work. I'm thinking about the Institute of Human Obsolescence that designed a machine that basically digs cryptocurrencies using the heat of the body where someone is sleeping. So the idea that we make money while sleeping and not while working, and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of neo-Marcusian attitude in this. And I'm not saying that this is sort of very radical, but I think it's not radical if it's not linked to any project. It's not radical if it's not linked to any project. But I think we should take into account also what happens within the very, probably I would say, very harmless field of the autonomy of the work of art, because something is happening. Because artists, alter institutions, fictional institutions are turning to the necessity to imagine futures beyond capitalism. Maybe, especially with a sort of accelerationist twist, but this is not really important. I'm thinking about, for example, the work of Oliver Ressler, a work that we just exhibited at Sale, that is titled "Everything is Coming Together While Everything is Coming Together While Everything is Falling Apart." It is a series of 5 films on 5 basic expressions of the movement for climate justice in Europe. Soon it's going to be a 6th film, because it was in Venice in September filming the climate camp that, together with other people, we organized in Venice. And I think when you enter this filmic archive, you really see a sort of real utopia. The fact that you really feel that the point of Oliver's work is the power of the archive, basically. If you see his films only one at a time, you're missing the point of his work, I think. But if you're immersed in this filmic archive, you really feel that the utopia of a world that is saved from the capitalist destruction is not only imaginable, but it's already in motion. And we should be able to tune in with this motion. And also, it is important to, I want to tell you something about this climate camp, this transnational climate camp that we organized in Venice at the beginning of September. You know, we were able, I don't know, maybe you saw it on the news, we were able to occupy the red carpet of the Biennale Film Festival for more than 7 hours, basically showing again to the world, one more time, the urgency for climate justice. But here, I would like to address the reaction of the Biennale to that occupation as an art institution. The Biennale basically closed its gates. They never wanted to talk to us. They demanded everything to the police, so it was basically managed by the Biennale of Venice as a mere public order issue. The fact that we were there bringing such an urgent political claim. So I think there are two considerations here. So first of all, that we should review our rhetoric on biennials as flexible, multitudinarial, post-ideological institutions. Sometimes they can be very rigid, as a hardcore car industry of the 60s. And another point is that the gates for the Biennale were closed, but this also means that they were not able to incorporate us. This is another thing that Fischer talks about and speaks about in his book, the idea that capitalist realism is characterized by a condition of pre-incorporation, that every resistance is already in advance caught within the dispositif of capitalist realism. I think this is not true. We should avoid this paranoia, but of course we should not be naive. The point is to address, is to go through our institutions with things, with phenomena that cannot be reduced to cultural products. And this is a very condition for decolonizing them. And really the last thing, and then I'm handing over the microphone, the last thing, speaking of decolonizing, I don't know if you saw the recent film that was presented at Cannes, Bacurau. Did some of you see the movie? Someone saw it, yeah, someone saw it. So there is a little bit of spoiler, but I think the film is not really about the plot. So Bacurau is basically the story of a rural village in a near future in Brazil, where inhabitants are basically contrasting or are basically resisting a regime that cut them off all their water supplies to the village. Plus, there is one more problem, that the village is threatened by a psycho gang of US frustrated hunters that wants to go to hunting the very inhabitants. So the inhabitants, the rural inhabitants, can become the prey of these psychopath hunters. It's a sort of dystopian film, of course. The film ends with a successful resistance of the village of Bacurau. But what I wanted to say is that, and this also reminds me of the word of Yaiza, Bacurau as a community museum. Bacurau has its own community museum that basically the killers don't want to go to visit because they think it's just not important. Because if they have visited the community museum of Bacurau, they would have seen the traces of the fighting spirits of the population, the traces of the previous resistances of Bacurau, the fact that these people are not people that cannot defend themselves, but in fact they're fighters, and they're fighters in a non-hegemonic way. It is a community which is marked by queerness and also by the presence of magic. In fact, the community leader is a shaman woman. And also, in the end, the museum, the community museum, is one of the places where the people of Bacurau sets a trap for the hunters that are coming for the Western hunters that are coming to the village. So really, the museum is actually a true weapon for community, for this microtopian, non-hegemonic community. And this, I think, tell us something, that if we are really able to break the curtain of capitalist realism, I think we can discover that art is really that action, that powerful weapon, even beyond what we think it is. So thank you, and sorry for being very long.
Thank you, Marco.
Hi, thanks. So for my contribution, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this word, this phrase, acid communism. And it's sort of relevant because it's like acid communism was the prism through which Mark Fisher was attempting to reinterpret his earlier work and his earlier phrase, capitalist realism. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done on these ideas in the UK since Mark died in January 2017, and particularly around another phrase called acid Corbinism. And the Corbinism in that is a reference to Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the Labour Party. And Corbinism is the movement around him. So like, these are quite modest sort of, I take this as a report of some quite modest occurrences in the UK, which can't be unproblematically universalized, as we've been reminded today. But even though they're modest, I want to end by saying that this sort of discussion around acid Corbinism is having some real, actual, noticeable effects on the UK left, and actually possibly on policy. Well, definitely on policy, and that policy could actually be the policy of the UK government before Christmas. It may not be either. No, I don't think it's utopian at all. I think there's a very, very good chance that Labour would win the next election. If it ever happens. So like, most people in this room, I don't know who's in this room, but I assume most people on this panel know that that the phrase acid communism was the title of a book that Mark Fisher was working on before he died. He never finished it. He only left a few fragments of that project, basically. A couple of talks, a few articles, and then the introduction to the proposed book, Acid Communism, which was republished in the collection of his works, K-Punk, recently. You know, but in those fragments of this unfinished work, you know, I think you can see a sort of profound reinterpretation, a profound reassessment of capitalist realism, right? And you know, the gloss in this story is something like, you know, the movements of 2011 and then the subsequent sort of electoral turn that followed it. You know, they represented fairly profound cracks in capitalist realism, which allowed Marx to do a sort of reversal of perspective. And like the phrase reversal of perspective is most associated with the Italian operaist movement from like the early 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, but then, you know, gets taken up into what's often called autonomism or autonomous Marxism, etc. And so the structuring concept of operismo, which you can find in the early works of Mario Tronti, for instance, is that too much Marxist analysis takes the point of view of capital, and we need to reverse the perspective and take the point of view not of workers, but of working class autonomy. So that's our struggles to escape from the cramping that our lives suffers because by capital's need to expand itself, basically. So our struggles to be more than just workers, or to be more than just housewives, or to be more than just renters, or whatever. So the full title of the proposed book by Mark Fisher was going to be Acid Communism on Post-Capitalist Desire. And I think that's where the reversal of perspective is, right? It was a reversal of perspective. Mark Fisher would now look at capitalist realism from the perspective of post-capitalist desire. So that is the desires that get created under current conditions, but whose fulfillment would actually require, you know, a completely new form of economic and social order. You know, from this perspective changes how you might see capitalism, right? And so Marx starts a gesture to say, Mark Fisher, not Marx, not Karl Marx, Mark Fisher starts to say, you know, perhaps we should see capitalism as simply a machine for warding off the possibility of a new society, the possibility of a society without domination, a society of non-domination, or even like the society of red plenty. He starts to talk about it in the book. And then he's even more specific. He says, look, we can understand neoliberalism as a project aimed at destroying to the point of making them unthinkable, this is a direct quotation, the experiments in democratic socialism and libertarian communism that were efflorescing at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. And so the idea is that, you know, the sorts of moments of collective euphoria at the height, the best moments of the struggles of those periods, produced desires which were so threatening to capitalism, we had to produce this 40 years of neoliberalism to ward them off. And the argument put forward is, you know, the left of the 60s and 70s failed because it failed at that point and were defeated. Comprehensively defeated in the late 1980s and early 1990s, because the left of that time failed to fully connect with the new desires that were being produced by the world of mass consumption, which was being developed in the post-war period, and also the desires that were produced out of the sort of partial suspension of the threat of destitution that occurred for the majority of the population in countries such as the UK, the US, and Western Europe. it rested on destitution around in the other parts of the world. We'll come back to that later, perhaps. And so acid communism for Mark Fisher designated those moments of collective euphoria in the 1960s and 1970s in which those new desires were given a left articulation and an anti-capitalist articulation. And the defeat of the left, the argument continues, in the 1970s allowed the right, the political right, to give an articulation to those desires and present its own conception of freedom. So the idea is to sort of try to return to those unfinished moments of acid communism, right? To examine them, but in particular to examine the futures that they thought they were heading towards at that point. To examine the futures they thought they were heading towards, to see if we can connect those futures to present conditions, right? The key prism through which Mark Fisher was seeking to understand the production of post-capitalist desires in the 1970s, 1960s, but 1970s in particular, was the idea of consciousness raising. Right? And he began to reinterpret capitalist realism as a project of consciousness deflation, a project to deflate the various raised consciousnesses that were prevalent in the 1960s and 1970s. In this endeavor, Mark was influenced by the work of the libertarian socialist group Plan C, which is a group in the UK that both me and Nadia Idle, who's also here, we're both members of that, and Mark Fisher was a member of Plan C at the time. So Plan C had begun experimenting with trying to revive the form of the feminist consciousness raising groups, which is the organizational backbone of the second wave feminist movement. And they're very simple forms. They're starting from 1969. Small groups of women would get together, discuss the problems in their lives, discuss the problems in their lives, recognize the commonality of those problems, and through recognizing the commonality of those problems, recognizing that those problems must have structural causes, and must not be therefore as they might previously have thought be the result of individual failings. How could they be if everybody shared them? They must have structural causes, and therefore by understanding they had structural causes, you could identify the areas by which you might apply collective action. Plan C, when we returned to that form, we were very influenced by an article called "We Are All Very Anxious." This article proposes that the dominant affect of the present is anxiety, and from that diagnosis, there is this proposition that any form of collective action would have to start with some form of consciousness-raising group aimed at overcoming the feelings of anxiety and precarity which are dominant today. And the reasoning is something like this, neoliberalism eliminates the political, right? Or what we might call, following Wendy Brown, neoliberal responsibilization, right? You are responsible for your own situation in life. Structural causes do not exist. The only thing that exists is the personal. If that's the case, if that's our starting point, then we should start with the personal and then work out to understand the structural, to rediscover the political. So when Mark Fisher took this framing to think about the tactics and technologies through which people were unearthing post-capitalist desires in the 1960s and 1970s, he produced a real moment of insight, I think, right? When he recognized that there was a continuity of project, or you could construct a continuity of project, between the consciousness-raising practices of the feminist movement at that time, which was also mirrored, in some ways prefigured in anti-colonial movements, and also in the Black Civil Rights and then Black Power movement in the US and to some extent the UK. He recognized a continuity of project between those sorts of practices and the sort of consciousness expansion project of the psychedelic movement. And so Mark Fisher sort of saw the practice of the psychedelic movement of that time in particular as an attempt to produce a sort of sense of interconnectedness with the cosmos. It doesn't matter whether you think that that is a legitimate thing or not. The actual in-effect practice, the in-effect result of those practices was to undermine a sense of or ideologies of individualism. Right, the sense of the ideologies of individualism, the structures of feeling that those ideologies give you, that what reality consists of as discrete individuals, and what political collectivities consist of are discrete individuals aggregating together, right? There was a sense of undermining that. And that is the acid in acid communism or acid Corbinism, right? It is LSD, acid. But like when he was talking about that, he didn't just mean that you could detect psychedelia in the effect of those who took LSD. He said you didn't need to take LSD in order to experience the effects of that psychedelic moment, right? Because it was transmitted in a more diffuse form, primarily through popular culture. We could use the example of the Beatles, the biggest band in the world at that time, who took LSD and fundamentally reformed the way they produce music. There was a burst of sonic, lyrical innovation. They changed the way they looked and they behaved, etc. And in that way, Mark Fisher argues, the sense of that reality is more plastic and changeable was transmitted in a wider sense. So this idea of like psychedelia as containing a possible expansion of social and political possibility, because it undermines what is presented as necessary and inevitable and reveals it as contingent and therefore in principle changeable. So those are a couple of different raised consciousnesses that were around in the 1970s. If somebody from the 1970s, from the UK in the 1970s was time-travelled to the contemporary UK, or perhaps even more specifically, the UK of the early 2000s, which is when Mark was writing Capitalist Realism. If somebody was time-travelled from there, what they would notice most was the elimination of another form of consciousness, class consciousness. The idea that there are different classes who have different and in principle antagonistic interests. That wasn't just part of the structure of feeling of the 1970s. It was incorporated into the very institutional structures of that time. That was just it was the basis upon which institutional structures were formed and economic policy was formed, etc. That's one of the things that has been most eliminated, the idea, and it's sort of come back a little bit, the idea that there are classes, or that class is a category from which you could apply to understand the world. And when we look back at the sort of countercultural practice of the 1970s, we can see that the counterculture and class politics were often opposed at that time, or proposed as being in opposition in some way. In fact, what we probably, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and see what we were probably seeing there was a transformation in class composition, right? And those practices of countercultural practices, and indeed just subcultural practices, right? Subcultural practices where working class and lower middle class youth had a pretty strong control over the production of popular culture in the UK in the post-war period, and they were inventing new ways of living, etc. We can just see that as a project of complexifying the working class, and it's the project of complexifying the working class, which more closely resembles the working class as we see it today than nostalgia for some 1950s industrial proletariat. Okay, so the phrase acid Corbinism is something that's emerged over the last couple of years, and it's a discourse that is not necessarily attached to the figure of Jeremy Corbyn, but it's attached to the re-emergence of the left that's happened in the UK, in Western Europe, and in the US at the moment. Right? And so we've taken this re-emergence of sort of a young, dynamic left. We've taken this as an injunction to remove acid communism from a sort of from its where it might be safely stored in a sort of art world ultra-leftism, where we could say it's a nice thing, and move it to the world of immediate political strategy, right? Immediate political strategy, immediate political practices, and in fact also potentially policy. This phrase, acid Corbynism, emerged with a workshop at this festival called The World Transformed in 2017. It sparked a flurry of articles exploring the idea. The most substantial manifestation is a podcast and radio show that me and Nadia and our friend Jeremy Gilbert do on called ACFM. AC being Acid Communist or Acid Corbynist Radio. It comes out on Novara Media. And basically we use it to discuss concepts such as collective joy, the weird left, the dialectic between love and hate, consciousness raising, etc. These sorts of discussions that we're trying to promote. And in addition to that, we've also developed a series of live events, primarily a form of acid communist consciousness raising groups that me and Nadia have been doing around the country, which people seem to find quite powerful, actually, and in a whole series of other sorts of workshops where we're trying to get people to engage in these sorts of ideas in the here and now. The primary network through which these events are organized, is the World Transformed network. And so the World Transformed, what started as a political festival, which was organized at the same time and in conjunction with the Labour Party conference. So it alternates between Liverpool and Brighton. It's quite a big festival. They sold 6,000 tickets this year. But now, over the last sort of year or so, it's been translating into a permanent year-round political education network, where there be individual transformed events in individual cities. If you want to look at the sort of the ecology of the Corbynite left, or the left, the Corbynite left and the left around the Corbynist movement, you would say that the World Transformed network represent a particular political pole. They're probably the most, they're like the most libertarian socialist wing of the Corbynite movement. So most attached to John MacDonald, who's the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Shadow Finance Minister. And so many of those people hold to what might be called an in and against the state strategy. And in fact, John MacDonald called for a cadre, an in and against the state cadre in a meeting last year. So we've had this idea that this sort of like this sense of libertarian socialism, of which we would probably position acid Corbinism as the cultural wing. We had this sense that this might be the common sense of what I'd call generation left, the new sort of young left that's emerged at this point. That seems to be reflected in opinion polling, but you couldn't see it in the institutions of the Labour Party at all until just the latest Labour Party conference, which passed a series of quite radical policies. The most significant one is it passed a Green New Deal policy, which dedicates the Labour Party to institute the decarbonisation of the UK economy by 2030. They also passed a 4-day working week, so a policy to reduce the working week to 4 days, or extend the weekend to 3 days, as is more commonly known. By 2030 again. There was also a motion passed to abolish private schools, or public schools as they're known, and in favour of free movement. Like, just because you pass those policies at a Labour Party conference doesn't mean they come into being, right? Even if a Labour Party gets elected into power, into government, doesn't mean it has power, right? But I still think it's significant this sort of direction, the campaigns that were driving those policies and got them passed, they all come out of the World Transformed section of the Labour Party. And I think you can see a sort of acid Corbynist inflection in how some of them are being put forward. So the most sustained iteration of what a Green New Deal would look like, produced by a think tank called Commonwealth, they talk about the necessity to create moments of collective joy, for instance. Right? And they talk about the need for communal luxury, which is paired with private sufficiency, which are things that we've been sort of talking about. And I'll just finish on, if we put these sorts of things together and the discussions that have been surrounding these policy proposals, I think you can sort of see a conception of freedom emerging, a conception of freedom on the left, which is different to the neoliberal conception of freedom in which we've been operating. The neoliberal conception of freedom is basically, it reduces down to the freedom of the property owner, the investor, to tend to their investments, and then to some extent the freedom of the consumer. Those are exhausted because the era in which a large proportion of the population can have access to property or to increased levels of consumption. Those conditions are gone. They were destroyed by 2008. And so I think you can see a new conception of freedom, and it's something like, a left conception of freedom, which is about collectively exercising control over your life, right? So I'm based on a feeling of the increased capacity you feel that comes from connecting with other people, productively, right? So it's like this attempt to see other people as a solution rather than a problem, as we've tended to see them.
Yes, we'll start in a second. Just need to open up a website as well. Probably this presentation will be, you know, something completely different than the previous ones. And we'll speak English for the sake, you know, of internationalism, right? To remain in the spirit. Unfortunately, maybe, although, you know, we're not trying to be universal, we'll speak about a very local initiative, actually. So, hello, we are...
Bogda Stefańska.
And Jakub Debczyński, we are art historians. And we are here to represent the anti-fascist year. And just a quick note, you know, we are just faces speaking for the anti-fascist year. We are not the only people behind it. You know, we are just part of the core group of the initiators of the whole initiative. But, you know, there are many more people behind the anti-fascist year, as you'll see in a second, probably. And the anti-fascist year is a countrywide initiative promoted by a coalition of public institutions, NGOs, social movements, collectives, individual artists and activists across Poland. And our common goal is to support anti-fascist struggles and mainstream and facilitate anti-fascist ideas and messages. And we'll mean, I think I'll skip the part when we try to link, you know, the anti-fascist year to capitalist realism and Mark Fisher's ideas, although, you know, fascism might be also one of the areas that, you know, Mark Fisher proposed to highlight in order to, you know, start deconstructing the capitalist realist frame. So, you know, he pointed to bureaucracy, mental health, climate change, you know. In our context, fascism is also one such area that we might try to discuss in order to start deconstructing the capitalist realist frame. And we believe that, you know, the anti-fascist year basically opposes capitalist realism and the ideology and its premises, both by promoting and mainstreaming anti-fascism, and also in its form, because it's based on grassroots cooperation of different individuals, organizations, groups, and institutions. And we, as the anti-fascist year, all of us together, hundreds of people right now, we take a clear, distinct political position in the ideological struggle, which is fundamental for our societies, and which is, you know, this struggle, the anti-fascist struggle, is very often erased from public discussion and public debate in favor of, you know, supposedly non-ideological ideology of capitalist realism. But, like we said, we're not, you know, diving deeper into theoretical stuff. We're going to talk practice this time. So the anti-fascist year and, you know, this conference, as you'll see in a second, is also embedded in the activities and the program of the anti-fascist year. So all of you are part of the anti-fascist year, at least for a couple of hours now. So the anti-fascist year is three things at the same time. First, it's a broad coalition, like I said already, of public institutions, NGOs, social movements, collectives, artists, activists, and other individuals and groups. Second of all, it's a platform for all those different subjects to cooperate, exchange knowledge, exchange good practices, ideas, and work together on projects, activities, and events. And third of all, the anti-fascist year is a common name for a program of anti-war and anti-fascist cultural events, social, political, and educational activities, which are being held in many places all over Poland, and the programs obviously developed by coalition itself. Kuba already elaborated on the very beginnings of the idea of the anti-fascist year, so we'll skip that part as well, which makes it possible that we'll actually stick to 15 minutes time frame. So what started as a small idea, you know, very modest idea of a small group of art workers, artists and activists, developed in a huge countrywide coalition with, you know, an extensive program of events with over 100 participants, over 100 events now, and it's, you know, still growing. We're hardly managing to operate our email account now because we're getting like dozens of emails with new submissions every day. Can you hold it for me for a second? Because I want to just to switch. Let's leave it like this. You know, the anti-fascist year has its own. Yeah, I'm no good with Mac systems, so I'm afraid that I'll, you know, spoil everything. Oh yeah. No, just wanted to show you that, you know, the anti-fascist year, first of all, has its own logo. That we started with creating a brand, one might say, a mark. You know, this logo, this one, or it has also other versions. We use this logo to label all of the events and activities that being part of the program. So you'll probably find the anti-fascist year's logo also in the materials that are part of this conference, and No, we can go back to the website. Yeah, yeah, do strony. You know, yeah. So we started with the trademark, and we also started with a website, which is like the main hub of the initiative. It's now, fortunately, thanks to a grant that we obtained from the Foundation for Arts Initiatives, it's also translated in English. Mostly it will be fully translated in a matter of weeks. So, you know, obviously when you open the website, you'll find the statement. Then we have an info part with like a brief, frequently asked questions section, which explains what this initiative is. Then we have a calendar and a section of events, as you'll see if it opens up. So there's a calendar with all the events that we are holding as part of the Anti-Fascist Year initiative, and those events are, you know, happening in most of the major cities. Most of the major cities in Poland. They are organized by big institutions like, you know, Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. This conference and the exhibition is also part. It's also part of the Anti-Fascist Year. Some of them are organized by small grassroots groups or even anonymous collectives operating in small towns all across Poland. So we have, yeah, both big institutions, big public institutions, museums, theaters, but we also have NGOs, social movements, all kinds of different subjects. And we also have, those events are very, very different, right? There are exhibitions, obviously, and there are theater plays, there are concerts, there are parties, you know, like the club culture in Poland is an important part of the Anti-Fascist Year, like an obvious ally for an anti-fascist initiative. We have workshops, discussions, conferences, talks, or even, you know, simply education activities. We have seminars at academies and universities. Another part of the website, which is very, very important for the Anti-Fascist Year, is the Atlas, which is like a social archive of anti-fascist and anti-war activities and attitudes in culture, art, and other fields. And the research for this Atlas was developed by Bogna, me, and our colleague Alexei, who maybe already joined us or not. He'll be here tomorrow for sure. And, well, we are art historians, so we thought what we might contribute to the anti-fascist struggle in Poland nowadays. Well, we decided to create this Atlas and a huge, like, archive, which is completely free, and all the articles are published under a Creative Commons license, so you can make use of them, hopefully for anti-fascist causes. We hope so. So the archive serves both as a proof that, you know, anti-fascist and anti-war art and cultural activities and social activism has a long history, but it's also like a database with sources of inspiration for us, for our contemporary activities, what we can do, what contemporary artists could do. And, you know, for example, a lot of institutions make use of this archive as an inspiration for their programs, for their exhibitions, for what they do. You can see also we have some profiles of social media, you know, like Facebook and a cool Instagram with a lot of violent images and a lot of swastikas. Facebook, on which we publish updates, new entries to the Atlas. You know, we obviously promote all of the events which are part of the Anti-Fascist Year, and publish some theoretical texts, also links to other sources as well. And now we can return to the presentation, and also thanks to the Foundation for Arts Initiative, we are very thankful to them for the financial help. And we also have now a material form of the Anti-Fascist Year, thanks to the FFAE and the hard work of the Ruch artistic collective. We have a traveling exhibition in the form of a mobile kiosk that we renovated, which is like a mobile exhibition of the year itself, which contains, you know, archival materials from our research. We exhibit some contemporary anti-fascist, anti-war artworks there. It is kind of thought to be, you know, we can easily exchange the display, so it can function in many different contexts. Now it's exhibited in Galeria Labyrinth in Lublin, and will, you know, during the next years travel around Poland to wherever it is needed, wherever, you know, anti-fascist and anti-war messages are necessary. So this is what the initiative is. And now the questions that we often ask ourselves is, how is it even possible that it exists? You know, because how does one organize such a countrywide network with so many institutions participating in so many events, with so many events organized, without actually any budget, you know, any resources, infrastructure, with, you know, in the beginning, no institutional support, now obviously more institutional support and some small budget, but still, you know, if you compare the budgets of specific events to the money that we actually used to promote them and link those events, these are, you know, incomparable. And probably Bogna will try to answer the question, you know, how was it even possible for the Anti-Fascist Year to come to existence and function?
Okay, so I will take it from here. So, as Kuba said, the anti-fascist year is founded on a couple of premises and ideas that we are going to discuss now. As an illustration for this, we'll show the diagrams by the Polish artist Maja Demska, in which she tried to map the whole initiative. Unfortunately, it's only in Polish, but you can see the scale. So, first of all, the anti-fascist year is a network made up from the sum of grassroots initiatives, and there is no particular structure for the network, nor there is an organization that controls how the whole project develops. So, the anti-fascist year is a sort of an umbrella, as you can see in this image, and it is the term used by many different individuals, collectives, institutions, and groups and organizations. And so it makes use of the snowball effect. Our anti-fascist snowball rolls, gathering new allies, ideas, and initiatives on its way downhill. The second thing is that the anti-fascist year is a coalition of the willing. So no one is obliged to take part. People join the coalition because on voluntary basis, because they want or because they feel a moral obligation to actively oppose the threats of war and fascism. So the third thing is that the anti-fascist year is founded on sharing and contributions. All the participants of the year simply share resources that they have, contribute what they can to the common initiative. And for example, institutions provide funding for the website and people who do the research and operate the email accounts. And update the website. Or they support anti-fascist initiatives and groups with infrastructure, with materials and with resources. Or they simply organize the anti-fascist and anti-war events as a part of the usual program and activities. And people who participate in the anti-fascist year share their time, their competences, they try to bring new allies to the initiative, they organize all the kinds of anti-fascist and anti-war events, they take part in demonstrations, paint banners, etc. And what is also important, they share responsibilities for the anti-fascist year. So the anti-fascist year is also a jigsaw puzzle made from all these smaller and bigger pieces, which are all very important and treated equally within the frame of the initiative. The fourth thing is that the coalition is founded on the idea of self-education. So the anti-fascist year is a platform for exchange knowledge, ideas, and good practices. And the atlas on our website is a source of inspiration, and it's for everyone to use. So anti-fascist year is a kind of common good. We can share it, we can use it, we can learn from it. And it's a sort of a toolbox that provides us with tools to understand the current socio-political situation, as well as tools to oppose fascism, both in institutions and on the streets. So, to educate ourselves, we meet the members of the anti-fascist year meet every couple of months to educate. The assemblies are dedicated to specific topics, like, for example, anti-fascist education, and they are hosted in different cities, in different institutions. Our meetings took place in Poznań, Gdańsk, Warsaw, Orońsko, so many different places. The fifth thing is that the program of the anti-fascist year is not curated. We follow the rule that you can see here on the upside on the top of the slide. Disorder is a part of anti-fascism. So it's written there in Polish. So people, groups, and institutions that participate in the anti-fascist year, they are free to interpret the slogan against war, against fascism in their own way. So this freedom in understanding the contemporary anti-fascism allows for many different events and initiatives to join the coalition. So under the anti-fascist year umbrella, you will find a whole spectrum of different initiatives, which are not only anti-fascist and anti-war and anti-violence, but they are also anti-racist, pro-LGBTQ, pro-feminist, pro-ecological, etc. We have 2 more points. So sixth point is that the anti-fascist year lacks authorship, everything that the year itself has created does not belong to any institution or any person. All the information available on the website and the research in Atlas are shared under the Creative Commons license. So although the website and research are financed by a couple of institutions, they don't belong to them. So everyone can use those resources, reprint them, link them, use them, share them. So the anti-fascist year operates via pollination. So it spreads on its own, it germinates without any coordination, actually. And the last one is the seventh thing is that the anti-fascist year is based on cooperation, not competition. All the different groups, institutions, and individuals don't compete with each other. They do not try to organize the best, the biggest anti-fascist event. Rather, they share knowledge and resources working together on one big topical project. So to sum up, thank you. So to sum up, we want to show you a diagram of anti-fascist year that we developed during the Art of Cooperativism workshop in May 2019, organized by Kuba Scheder, with Katrin Gibson, Katrin Baum, and Bina Choi. And this is the original drawing that we made then, and so we prepared the digital version of it. So in the center of the diagram, there is an anti-fascist seed, which is made of all the elements that we described, and which are not always visible. We planted the seed in this nutritious soil full of both enthusiasm and political anxiety, and then the seed grows and blooms with the projects, events, activities, content, knowledge, and alliances. So, in effect, it seeps and radiates anti-fascism, contaminating the outside with our ideas. So maybe the sum up from...
Yeah, basically that's it. You know, actually, yeah. It was even less than 15 minutes, which is very good. Although it is only because we omitted the Mark Fisher part. So we think that I don't think that the anti-fascist year is just the perfect answer to any of the problems that, we only started discussing. We'll discuss for the next couple of hours or even 2 days, right? But we think that at least it's a good example, a good example of practice also, and a good starting point for a discussion on how to build like a wide international anti-fascist coalition, which actually, wouldn't fall into the universalism trap, right? Yeah, this is also another challenge for us. But yeah, we'll be very happy to continue discussing, the initiative and tell you more about it during the assembly tomorrow, and discuss together with all of you, how we can form new international alliances, how we can expand this anti-fascist idea and bring it to the international level. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. All the participants, especially our younger friends and colleagues, thanks for your enthusiasm and intelligence and hard work. Really, congratulations, and also for lowering the age level of the panel. Well, I mean, the thing is that we've had traces of not only the urgent need, but also the actual possibility of thinking and acting beyond the capitalist condition, and to break the paralyzing double bind in which we were usually trapped, and the possibility of rephrasing capitalist realism by applying what I would call, probably close to Yaiza, a pragmatic radicalism, one that avoids self-deception and naivety in terms of objectives and goals, but applies radicality, as probably you've done, in terms of processes and forms of collective action. And I think that's something that we can share and discuss, what these forms of collective action can be about. But probably feminism and ecological justice movements can teach us about it. Well, we have very, very little time, but I think it's now the moment in which people from, well, all of us can come and contribute, ask our speakers. We have how much? Half an hour time to do so. So go ahead. Yeah, Angela. How can we? Yeah, I know it's Pavel is taking.
Fantastic. I'm like full of admiration for the anti-fascist year, and thank you for all your talks. I wanted to ask two things. First of all, about acid communism, or rather acid Corbinism. There can be some kind of consciousness confusion, you know, with drugs. I mean, to what extent are you able to differentiate? I mean, is this some kind of appeal to which generation specifically, the acid kind of prefix of communism or Corbinism, for that matter? And my second question is for the anti-fascist year representatives. Very pleased to see you again. Have you, normally anti-fascism is persecuted. It is persecuted everywhere I know of. And this question can be put both in positive or in negative terms. In positive terms, is anti-fascism protected when it's brought into culture? And the negative way of putting this is somehow anti-fascism ignored, you know, when put into culture. You can choose which way to go. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm not quite sure what your question was, but I'll answer the question I wanted to answer. So what generation is it aimed at? And which part of that? Is that like the communism bit or the acid bit?
The acid bit.
Yeah, okay, so it's not aimed at the boomers necessarily, right? It's aimed at perhaps a younger generation. But let's just explain it a little bit more, you know. The reason, so acid communism and acid Corbinism are both jokes, but they're jokes with a serious intent. And part of the reason it's a joke with a serious intent is because acid liberalism is the ideology from which our communication systems, you know, the platforms upon which we interact, that is the ideology upon which they are based, right? A load of Silicon Valley people going and taking ayahuasca, puking up, having revelations and interpreting them into a liberal framework. So the gamble is, you know, hidden beneath that, those platforms. You know, the reason people are engaging with those platforms is not due to the attraction of acid liberalism. It's due to the absolute desire for sociality, the desire for productive connections with other people, which is increasingly hard to find through those platforms. Do you know what I mean? So you know, it's a joke, but it's a joke with a serious intent, because that is the ideology that dominates us in some ways, right? I mean, obviously fascism also dominates us, but I don't want to live in a world where the choices are fascism or acid liberalism, basically. So that's why I'd refer to acid communism.
Thank you.
Well, I think that, you know, that's a difficult question to answer, obviously. We have a lot of arguments about that, whether actually mainstreaming anti-fascist ideas via the world of culture, via the art world, via museums and theater is, you know, a good idea. Some of the grassroots anti-fascist activists in Poland actually, they reject the idea. They say that, you know, as soon as you mainstream anti-fascism, it stops being anti-fascism, right? It becomes part of the, you know, liberal mainstream. When mainstream liberal newspapers write about anti-fascism, for example, writing reviews about some events organized in the frame of the anti-fascist year, some people simply oppose that, right? Is anti-fascism protected? Well, I don't know. It depends, you know, on how very much, you know, our cultural sphere is in deep defense, right? We are in the corner. We can see what's happening, how, you know, for example, heads of different institutions are simply exchanged according to the will of the ruling party, right? This is what's happening now in Poland. So I don't know if cultural world can, you know, be a space that's, you know, protecting anti-fascism and anti-fascist ideas and messages. We can, you know, form alliances. Is it ignored? Well, I think it is less ignored. You know, still, cultural world in Poland, and I'm speaking only about Poland, you know, I don't dare to speak about the situation in other countries. You probably know better how it looks in other countries. Still, there is some power, you know, to culture. It's not huge power, it's just a little bit of power that cultural institutions still possess. And it's easier, for example, for an anti-fascist demonstration to be covered in mainstream media when it's you know, it happens in the frame of a, you know, performance co-organized by a group of artists that happens during the demonstration. So it, at least slightly, it might help to mainstream it. It also, you know, allows us to form new alliances and find more comrades that could join us together, or that we could join during one of, you know, events that they organize. So I don't think it's really protected, but I think it's slightly less ignored. That would be our answer. But, you know, it's just a couple of thoughts that I gathered in like 30 seconds, so maybe I'm wrong.
There was some question, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for these wonderful and powerful interventions. I have perhaps to start with Yaiza and to connect things with Marco and the anti-fascist year. The question of internationalism is a question right now, actually. I think, I mean, particularly I agree, Yaiza, with the need, the radical need to get out of the universalist horizon that regulates way of doing. The point is, in your presentation, it seemed also to contest the possibility of internationalism. This is something that I would like, because the anti-fascist year proposed it in the opposite. The feminism movement today is proposing the same, and actually different movements like Gilets Jaunes or Equator or Chile right now are not only contesting, not only fighting against some laws. This is the first step, but what are they defining? It's their lives. So that's something which is not universal, but it's something that connects different kind of struggles. So how do you think this exit of universalism to the possibility to connect different struggles or needs or desires in different scales? Thank you.
Thank you also, Mabel, because I'm really relieved that you asked that question, because I was quite conscious that for the sake of sticking to time, it probably kind of left a residual impression that I was defending some kind of, you know, neo-regionalism, or the kind of, you know, stick to your own and never kind of talk to anyone who's a foreigner, who's obviously not what I'm trying to do here, but it is something that I'm kind of often accused of doing. So, no, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's in a way, it's like once you get out of the kind of binarism that universalist positions actually impose, so that you're either kind of, you know, trying to grapple with the whole world at once, or you are some kind of backward regionalist, you know. I think these possibilities for international connections otherwise become more clear. And I think you've actually basically hit the nail on the head. Because I am absolutely clear, and in a sense, you know, that was one of the assets that in my mind, you know, the art world has, if it can offer something, is already, you know, that already extant international network that it offers, however, you know, problematic and failed in some ways. What I was arguing for is that those international connections should be established on the basis of problems that cut across us, and those problems cut across us at a local level, okay? So when I'm talking about staying put, okay, I often use this example, you know, so sorry if, you know, if this is being recorded and I'm like on YouTube 3 times saying this, but it is harder for me to organize a neighborhood assembly with the people that live in my block, okay, than it is for me to talk with colleagues in a biennial. Okay, so that notion of what international connection might mean, you know, which is that we meet each other in kind of art world events, is actually imaginary. You know, there's no friction going on there. By in a sense tapping into this resource of what we can do when we offer a way of coming together. Actually, you know, the consciousness raising example to me is actually very valid. You know, what happens when you give yourself time and space to go through troubles that we are all collectively affected by, you know, perhaps in different kind of gradients or with, you know, different levels of severity. And what happens is that the world starts to appear as something different. So, you know, this is not about, you know, refusing those international connections, but kind of understanding that they should be established on the basis of the homework, in a sense, that we've done previous to them. That we are connecting with each other precisely to establish solidarities, so that if somebody is in danger, we go there where we are needed, rather than presupposing that because what we offer is this diagnosis of the present as a whole, in advance of this kind of local diagnostics, we are constantly just meeting in the space of the phantasmatic global. I don't know if that sounded like a clarification or, further obscurantism, but I hope it's somewhat clear. Yeah.
Well, is it working? Yeah. Okay. Well, internationalism. Well, I think if we take again the example of the climate justice movement, how can you think of defeating something like climate change, if not on a global scale? I think that the minimum scale for a climate justice movement is the continental one, is a European one. How can you just imagine, again, to defeat or reverse the effects of climate change just by reimposing national sovereignty or thinking that you can be self-sufficient at home? I mean, again, the climate camp in Venice was a small example, but it was a very interesting one in terms of quality. There were 1,000 activists, 500 were from Italy, and the other half was from all over Europe, basically. And also in terms of, again, prefigurative politics, or what was happening in the camp, there was a very interesting quality of the political work that we did together, a contamination, a deterritorialization of our different political languages, because Europe is small, but there are huge differences between movements in the Mediterranean area and those of Northern Europe, for example. And this was an encounter that, in a way, and I speak from the position of someone who have been doing like social movements for the last 15 years, there is an unseen quality, and I think this unseen transnational quality deserves to be fully experimented. And also the fact that there were voices from Nigeria, for example. There were like indigenous women from the Mapuche people in Patagonia that brought their perspective. And besides the fact that was, of course, an enrichment, they also put us in front of our privilege, being on the same side. And then how do you, I don't know if this is about defeating universalism, but for example, I think it's important, again, I'm thinking of this green issue. It's important, for example, to refuse or let's say the rhetorics of the Anthropocene, for example, and what helps us to situate ourselves in a more differentiated, specific, but also solidal way within this phase is, for example, the idea of Capitalocene, for example. The idea that we are not all equals within this crisis, and at the same time, it's not everyone that produced this crisis to the same level. There are asymmetries within this crisis. If you basically accept the category of the Anthropocene, you will not see these asymmetries, these differences. You again will run the risk of the universalization. We think we're all the same. We're not all the same. There is a system whose name is capitalism, which bears the responsibility, the most of the responsibility for the situation of the biosphere now. Of course, the answer is not real socialism. Real socialism is not a sustainable, environmentally sustainable model, of course. And within this history, there have been different positions and different, of course, different positions. So I don't know if I answer, but I think that the point is an internationalism that basically keeps into account the fact that universalism is bad.
Just as a clarification, we use the word internationalism in the title of this conference, being conscious of the both colonial and critique, and also the need to have the notion of the nation as an object of critique as well. We did it on purpose, I think, in the context of the anti-fascist year, like invoking the specter of the internationalism of the workers' movement in the 30s. So, I mean, the movement of solidarity among the people, about the workers. I mean, it was an explicit quotation of the workers' front against fascism. So, I mean, the thing is, I mean, just was a way of clarifying that we are not just promoting a new internationalism as a universalism. I mean, even if is one of our tasks here to think how can we do things together. But I mean, it was a historical quotation in many respects.
But also because we do have categories in order to avoid this. I mean, now Anthropocene, Capitalocene, there's also like the Thulucene, as you know, that I think is not such a productive category, even if it's important. I mean, because it underlines the fact that beyond like class, gender, privilege, you also have like the species privilege, and also sort of enlightens a sort of way out of capitalism, where the idea is to making keen is the idea of multi-species alliances. And I think is of course important. It's probably less productive on a urgent political level. It's more of an academic debate. Capitalocene is kind of more comprehensible, probably more applicable. But I mean, we do have tons of categories to avoid universalization within this phase.
I think we have time for a couple of more questions.
There is one here.
Thanks for clarification of internationalism, but I could also ask why not non-aligned movement. So still it is very northern, very western. And again, one could ask if the end of globalization is again a very northern or western reception. When you look on China, on India, on the African continent, I would say this is not the end of globalization, first of all, and I think there's a new way of globalization which is maybe even beyond the North. It is a globalization of globalization. So you have crisscross connections between the global South, which we might think it's the end, but it might be a totally new or different starting. So that is one question. The other is what people call globalization from below, and they see it not totally negative, and that is the question of global migration, which is also a force. Yes, I understand this is not an organized political group in general. This is not how we can call it politics in the classical sense. Organized party politics or lefties are organizing itself, but it is, I would say, a movement which crosses the perception of end of globalization, and even we include that, we could think of a new internationality or a new non-aligned movement, or however we call it as a kind of global perspective. But I would ask, and maybe it will be discussed in the alter globality, and I'm too early and too quick, but I would ask, because it is a bit of the basis of the whole conference, if we could reflect that. Thanks.
I was called, so I have to explain. Right, I'm very, how to say it, I mean, maybe I should be more used to this, that people treat words very seriously. And then, in fact, with this, and maybe this is also somehow biased by our own situation here in Poland. So it might be very locally embedded, in this sense that by this end of globalization, we obviously did not mean the end of kind of interconnectivity and so on, but rather the collapse of certain type of ideology. Like also, at least in Poland, it was this kind of catch-up modernization. Like, in early 2000s, you wanted to be more global, and then there was this kind of all constantly becoming more integrated with Europe, and it had certain premises, and promises as well. And I think these promises collapsed around 2015, 2016, you know. So this is more to signal this, and also obviously we from the very onset we knew that this is going to provocative. So and kind of thank you for being provoked in this sense. As about internationalism, but this I think connects even more profoundly to this problem of universalism versus locality. You know, we are living here in this country. It's a very weird situation in which kind of modernity came from outside, in a sense. So it was always modernizing, or like being modernized. You know, it wasn't sort of source of a capitalist modernity in itself. This country was basically feudal country by the Second World War. Not only that, the only form that we really know of modernity, I mean, obviously it was all modern in terms of historical development, because we all know, or yeah, like some of us at least are very well aware of this world system theory of like Immanuel Wallerstein, in which you have these models of parallel development and undevelopment. So Poland was modernizing as an underdeveloped country of feudal structure that supplied raw materials to the capitalist centers. That was for centuries. But then, you know, you had always this dream of the modernizing in terms of like becoming like capitalist core. The globalization was the last iteration of this call. And there are two paradoxes. One paradox is that the form of modernity that we are aware of, or like the form of universalizing modernity that was implemented here, was actually real socialism or communism. So you know, like and for Polish people, basically, also for people coming from Eastern Europe, I think that Moderna Galeria makes an amazing work in, for example, reviving non-aligned movement, is to try to take a look at this universalizing project from a position of a post-communist country. Another paradox, which is of a even more profoundly political nature, given our current debates, is that post-colonial or decolonial narratives are instrumentalized by the right-wing authoritarians to defend our own culture against all this type of Western imports, like women rights, like gay rights, like minority rights, like any type of what we would think as part of the liberal kind of modernity or post-modernity, whatever, you know, but a kind of like liberal civic culture. So this is considered as being a kind of external cultural import, but we need to defend our own kind of nation, like as if it was colonized currently by this, you know, like I just don't want to, there are like several different ways how it is presented, you know, it might be named civilization of death, it might be like, you know, just some sort of corruption, moral corruption, and so on and so forth, you know. And I mean, it is only paradoxical because when you see how Western nations are demodernizing in a sense, the same narratives are getting kind of, are being activated in the internal debates also even in Western Europe. So you might have like ultra-right or alt-right cause that defend real people against kind of like modern civic liberal elites, you know? Like real kind of like public folk politics in the sense of folk in the German sense of this word, of like folk as a nation, as people, as a kind of, you know. So this is like, I think that it still does not explain our choice of wording for the title, but at least it gives a kind of wider response to this provocation and this debate that I think is obviously, we all find it's very provocative. And maybe to finish, this title was considered as an opening of a debate and not as its closure.
Thank you. Sorry, it's slightly off topic in terms of where we've just gone with the conversation. It's back to talking about the consciousness raising groups and Plan C. And I was just wondering if maybe you and Nadia could talk a bit more specifically about those and the types of places that you've been running them and who's been attending, and if you've run into any challenges, what those sessions have been like or have included. That would be great.
Yeah. So I mean, we've run them in various places. Quite often they're in. So the first one we ran actually was in the Transmedial Festival in Berlin in 2018. We got asked to go to speak about what we've been doing. We developed a consciousness raising group, and so you know it was people from the art world in Berlin. They seem to really love it. I've also been to Berlin amongst the more political scene, the sort of activist scene in Berlin, and tried to talk about similar things, and they basically didn't get it at all, which is interesting. So we've run them, we've run them in nightclubs before a dance party starts to happen. With like 80, 100 people in a darkened nightclub, with the light shining, so you can basically not see anyone, and it still seemed to work. Sometimes we've just been invited to a city, and you turn up, and whoever it's advertised, and whoever turns up just turns up. And they're very simple. They're very, very simple things. We basically, people get split into small groups, and then we ask them quite simple questions. So perhaps a question which is, when was the last time you felt truly free from work, or something like that? When was the last time you were bored? What did it feel like? And halfway through, we reveal that those sorts of questions, the other question we might ask is, have you ever used style as a weapon or a defense? Like that. And then halfway through, we reveal, look, those are the questions we would have asked somebody if we were trying to understand where post-capitalist desires get created in the 1970s. So, when work ended, was much clearer. It was much clearer then. The distinction between work and non-work was much clearer, for instance. Boredom was very, very different then. Boredom was like the absence of something to do. That's not what we experience now. We experience anime from compulsion to refresh your page or something like that. And so then we sort of ask, well, what questions should we have asked if we wanted to find out where post-capitalist desires are being created today? So it's a very simple format, and we've been very surprised at how forthcoming people are. People seem to find them quite powerful, and we're always sort of taken aback about how much people sort of share about their own lives. Well, I think it tells us something a little bit about the world that we live in, and that we have a sort of compulsion to testify in lots of ways. That is what we have to do. The one thing you can't do is to remain silent. We've reached a real limit point, though, and I think it relates to the previous discussion, which is I think there is a limit to the kind. So the idea of a consciousness raising group is you start with your own personal experience, and then you try and collectively to understand how that is being conditioned or limited by structural causes. And there's a real limit to that, because I don't think you can reach, the global level of structuration and structures just from your own personal experience. Frederick Jameson talks about cognitive mapping, and about how, perhaps in very, very early capitalism, you could understand how capitalism works from your own personal experience. Because look, there's a guy with a top hat and he owns the factory. All right, it's all there, isn't it? And then imperialism is the thing that separates that. Is that, your conditions of your life are dependent on what happens somewhere you basically cannot see. So the economist Jason Moore has this line. He says, behind Manchester stands Mississippi. You couldn't understand the construction of industrial capitalism in the north of England, in the city of Manchester. You couldn't understand how that was possible without understanding what was going on in Mississippi, which was slavery, and because that's where the cotton came. I mean, as it happens, those factory workers in Manchester did recognise that connection, because in the American Civil War, they raised money to buy a warship for the North, and the mill owners supported the South. And so the Manchester mill workers, that was against their own immediate economic interests, but they recognised a common, universal humanity. Do you want to?
Yeah, can I just do a quick elaboration? So this is Nadia from Plan C to answer your question on consciousness raising. Just a couple of things. I mean, like Keir touched on, it's really something that's been successful in the practice. So we can sit and talk about it as much as we like, but I think it's one of those things that even if you intellectually understand what it's supposed to do, it still seems to be a liberatory experience to go through asking those basic questions. Every time we do one of these workshops, which is distinctive from feminist consciousness raising in that it's not the same group meeting. It's a group of strangers, so we could do one now or we could do one tomorrow. Mostly people who don't know each other. And there seems to be something that tells you something about, the UK terrain, as in the scorched earth, as Keir has called it before, in that a lot of people, especially young people, have literally not had these conversations before. So they've not had conversations around their feelings and their experience of anxiety and boredom. And why this is politically important for us is it's basically taking this away from the realm of the privatization of stress. And it's making it about the collectivity and finding liberation through that collectivity. And that seems to be why it consistently works.
Oh, okay, it's just that, I mean, I asked to speak. Oh, what's funny? What did I say? Oh, was I meant to or not? Okay. No, simply because there was I also felt slightly interpellated by your intervention, and again, I felt I need to clarify. I mean, I guess it really does matter where you're speaking, okay? So in this forum, actually, in kind of pretty much any sort of art institutional forum, I give myself the benefit of the doubt, and give each other the benefit of the doubt that we are not defending, xenophobic or kind of, nationalist positions. But you are, absolutely right that, decolonial positions have been used in that way, most famously recently by Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. It has also, kind of fallen into a very pernicious neo-Rousseauian fetishization, especially of indigenous thought, so that the subaltern now is the one that's going to save us, apparently, and especially in relation to climate change, I find that extremely problematic. But, I mean, I guess that, what I'm talking about is the fact that, we are sharing a common enemy, okay, and that is the international dimension of capitalism. Okay, we are all, directly affected by it at a very personal and with very particular kind of variations as well, okay? So understanding those particular variations in their differentiality, I think is actually a real important part of this task. So this is just a question of method, okay? So it's not about, we have to stay in our local assemblies, just talking to the neighbors in our block, but we start from there. And I think that's just basically a method that hasn't been sufficiently mined in the art world. That's my very humble point, okay?
Thank you very much, everybody. I think we have to leave.